Well, howdy doody, sociologists. It's time to start on an entirely new topic, and it's social movements, our final one for the year. Nice. So, our learning goals for today, there are four. You're going to know what social movements are, obviously important. You're going to know a definition of social change. So, the official long title of this area of study is Social Movements and Social Change. I'm shortening it to social movements. You're going to know about the Dakota pipeline. So we are going to pick our own case study, but the textbook looks at the Dakota pipeline, and we might as well have a look at that as well. So you've got a couple of different things you can use as examples when writing answers. And finally, you're going to be able to analyze using SHEEP factors. That's social, cultural, historical, environmental, economic, political, technological. So when you're asked to analyze something, you're going to have that acronym in your head, and you're going to have 6 awesome things that you can write about. Boom. Okay, social movements. Let us talk about them. So we're looking at the purpose, evolution, power, and outcomes of social movements. They're the 4 main subtopics within the social movements thingy, okay? And we're shortening it, SOCMOV, or as you'll see in later slides, I'm just using SM. Can't be bothered writing social movements every time I want to say that word. So social movements are collective action. That's action by a group of people. You can't have a social movement if there's just one of you. And it's in response to something. So it might be a perceived inequality, something, those people have that, but those people don't have that. It might be in something that you think is unjust. It might be a group of people being oppressed, or it might be some demands that a group of people have that are not being met. One of the many things that social movements do is to raise awareness of the issue in the first place. Of course, if it was only to raise awareness, that would be a bit depressing. Most social movements raise awareness so that they can make some kind of change on society. And the purpose, there's a number of different purposes for social change. It might be for social movements. Social movements might be there to change society, social change. It might be to resist a change that has been made or is being made, or it might be to undo some social change that has already happened in the past. There you go. So there are 3 purposes, and we have ticked off our first little box. Yeah. Here's an example of a social movement. Hashtag #MeToo about sexual abuse of women. Another one here. Can't actually tell what that is, but there's a thing that they talk about in Crash called intersectionality, which is when you are a member of a number of minority groups. So there you go. This person is an Arab and an immigrant. Obviously, women are not a minority group, but anyway. So who knows? This looks like some kind of protest against poor conditions for teachers in the, I want to say US. Yeah, I think so. Teachers get very badly paid in the US. I wouldn't be surprised if they're protesting. All right then, social change. So social change means it's the change in views or values or norms or structures in society. And we can think of an example for each one if you like. So change in views might be reduction in homophobia. Change in values might be valuing the child more. If you read any Charles Dickens, you see that children used to have it pretty bad a couple of hundred years ago. Change in norms might be wearing masks in public. That's a common one at the moment. And change in structures might be setting up different social institutions or changing the ones that are already there. And social change is done in response to various factors, and there's all kinds, but here's a few. For example, laws. There might be social changes in response to laws. So for example, when gay marriage in Australia was legalized, the social change was that people who were gay started to get married. It's in response to the actions of interest groups, in response to the action of available resources, and in response to how society is organized. Social change is linked to other changes, yeah? So you don't usually see a social change where there's no other change of any other kind at all. So those sheep factors, political, economic, cultural, technological, environmental, you'll often find social change happens at the same time or because of one of these other kinds of changes, yeah? Just a random photo I thought I would insert that looked cool because it looks like some kind of social movement. I can't decide if it's real or not. Probably not. Here's an interesting slide, talks about different theories of social change. So, this is not part of the study design, but it is interesting. 3 theories on social change. You've got evolutionary theory. The main proprietor of that was Auguste Comte, who's considered the godfather of sociology. So you could almost say that he invented the study. The idea that society just moves in a linear, fairly steady direction, going from more simple to more complex structure. Well, obviously a lot of that's true given the fact that society is a lot more complex than it used to be. You've got conflict theory, which comes from Marx. The idea that there's all these different social groups in society that are in conflict with each other, and social changes is the result of all of that conflict. And then you got Emile Durkheim, who posited functionalist theory. So the idea that every different part of society has a function, and there's a natural equilibrium, a natural balance in society, and when society becomes unbalanced, that's when you see social change. So if you want some more interesting theories to drop into your responses, there's 3 there. All right then, the Dakota Pipeline. So it cost $3.7 billion, 1,900 kilometers long. So it's in Dakota. I'm going to show you a map in a second. It was basically bringing oil from where it was sucked out of the ground and pumping it to a place where it was going to get shipped out. And it was done so that it's basically more efficient than putting it on trains or, yeah. So it's cheaper to move that oil along the pipeline than by train, and it produced big profits for oil companies. So here you go. The shale area, that's where there was some oil in the ground that gets drilled out or whatever. That area in grey. And the pipeline is going to be this big red thing. So it's going to take oil from there to there, and then from Patoka it's going to get shipped out to international markets, and might be some refineries there. I don't know. Anyway, so it was this big long pipeline, and obviously the reason, well, as you'll see in a slide in a minute, the reason why this is controversial is because it was there's a potential, if there was any leak in these pipelines, which do happen, then it would pollute the drinking water for millions of people because it goes under the Mississippi River, big river system in the US, and also because it cut across a lot of sacred burial and important sacred sites for some Native American tribes. The Standing Rock Sioux, I think was the name of the main one there. So here's an example of the pipeline being built. Yep, so dig a big channel, put the pipe in it, and then put some fences around it. So there you go, you can see how thick the pipe is. Right, the activity, sheep factors. And this is what they stand for, just reminding you again: social, cultural, historical, economic, environmental, political, technological. Memorize that. That's why we're using the acronym SHEEPT. Social, cultural, historical, economic, environmental, political, technological. Memorize them. So just briefly, this is just an example. You can just follow along. This is an example of using SHEEPT to apply to something in Melbourne. I can't remember what it is, but you'll see in a sec. So this is what SHEEPT means. They're all the factors in a bit more detail. You might want to pause and read them in a bit more detail if you want. So this is using SHEEPT. You can use these SHEEPT factors to analyze, to investigate any issue. Quite common in geography as well. So they're looking at Docklands, yeah, that area in Melbourne that's been reclaimed. It used to be old shipping docks, and now they've turned it into apartment buildings and residential area with a bit of retail. So this is using the sheep factors, right? So the historical factors, blah, 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 here's the history of the area. The environmental factors, here's the environment of the area. Economic factors, so this is how much investment was made in the Docklands project. Political factors, so all the different political movements behind this idea of developing Docklands as a residential area. Technological factors, so what technology is needed to produce this precinct. Right, so what you're going to do, there's your sheet factors. I want you to take one social movement of your choice. So it could be Dakota Pipeline, it could be any social movement, it could be Black Lives Matter, could be fight against climate change, blah, 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 blah. I simply want you to write all of those 6 things and just give me one simple sentence about how that might be applied to your social movement. Brad. Okay, our first video today is from Khan Academy and it's called Social Movements. Take it away.
Social movements are instrumental to changing the path of a society. When a group of people comes together with a shared idea, they can create lasting effects by encouraging change in their society or by resisting it, both of which will shape the future of their society. But a social movement is not just a group of people with an idea. If that were the case, every little group with a novel idea would be starting a social movement. No, social movements need organization, leadership, and resources if they ever hope to gain momentum and make an impact. There are different types of social movements depending on their goal. Activist movements are focused on changing some aspect of society, while regressive or reactionary movements are actively trying to resist change. So you can generally see how a social movement will form. You get a group with a strong shared idea that has the resources and leadership to survive, and they can make a difference in one way or another. Specifically, though, it is not well defined. There are several theories as to how and why social movements form. One of these is called mass society theory. Early in the study of social movements, people were skeptical of the motivations of those involved in social movements. They were seen as dysfunctional, irrational, and dangerous, and that people would only join because the social movement provided a sense of community and refuge from the meaninglessness of life on one's own. This viewpoint was strong during the 20th century, the time of Nazism, fascism, and Stalinism, which were social movements that resulted in the destruction of millions of lives. But this theory did not persist through the century. By the 60s, scholars took a more open look at social movements, especially after the civil rights movement, which certainly did not arise simply to satisfy a psychological need for involvement. More recently, a few main theories have been developed. One is the relative deprivation theory, which focuses on the actions of groups who are oppressed or deprived of rights that other people in their society enjoy. So, if you look at the civil rights movement from this viewpoint, it is obviously a response to the inequality and oppression experienced by people of color in the US. But what is interesting about social movements is that it isn't always the people who are the worst off who join up. More important is how people perceive their situation. Someone just scraping by can be happy as a clam because they made their dream of owning their own little corner bistro into a reality. And then a person making $100,000 a year is frustrated because they don't feel like they are respected by their company. So what you have to look at is the relative deprivation, the feeling of a discrepancy between legitimate expectations and the reality of the present. But that's not enough on its own. People must feel like they deserve better, and they must think that they cannot be helped by conventional means. According to relative deprivation theory, those 3 things are necessary for a social movement to form. A relative deprivation, a feeling of deserving better, and a belief that conventional methods are useless to help. But there are criticisms to this theory. Even people who don't feel deprived will choose to join a social movement. They join because they want to address a perceived injustice that they may not even suffer from themselves. It can be too risky for the most oppressed people to join a social movement because they may not have the resources to participate. They cannot take time off work to promote the idea. Even so, there are exceptions, as always. Under Cesar Chavez, migrant farm workers united to gain rights and job security. Another issue with the relative deprivation theory is that sometimes, even when all 3 factors are present, no social movement is created. Okay, so it has some problems, but it's a start at least. Another theory, resource mobilization theory, looks at the social movements from a different angle. Instead of looking at the deprivation of the people, the resource mobilization approach focuses on the factors that help or hinder a social movement, practical constraints like access to resources. Even the seemingly simple act of gathering together a group of people with a shared idea is not allowed everywhere. It takes more than an idea to start a social movement. You need money, materials, political influence, access to media. More than that, a social movement needs a strong organizational base to recruit members and then to unite them on a single idea. A good, charismatic figure is necessary to lead the group and focus the thoughts of members and the oppressed on the objective to convince them to organize. Again, looking at the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. stood as a beacon to the people of color who were oppressed. He knew how to speak to a crowd and unite them in a single idea, and how to gain the support he needed for the social movement to succeed. Then you have the rational choice theory, which proposes that people compare pros and cons of different courses of action, and choose the one that they think is best for themselves. The choices and actions of individuals who are trying to do the best for themselves shape the pattern of behavior in society. But there are a lot of assumptions for rational choice theory to work. You have to assume that all actions can be listed in order of preference, and that all preferences are transient. That means that, let's say, I like apples better than pears, and I like pears better than bananas. If that's transient, then that means I have to like apples better than bananas. It also assumes that a person has full knowledge of what will happen as a result of an action, and that a person has the cognitive ability to weigh different actions. These are a lot of assumptions, which are rarely all true. Social movements can even affect people not actively involved in them. Social movements can cause collective behavior like panics, where widespread unreasoning fear causes people to act hastily, and crazes, which are like fads, where something is incredibly popular for a short period of time, like the latest craze in music or dieting. This past year, the anti-vaccine movement has created a panic that has resulted in outbreaks of diseases that were once eradicated from the developed world. Now that we have a couple movements to toss around, it might be interesting to look at what happens to a social movement from beginning to either success or failure in the end. In the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a lot of people very angry and has been widely regarded as a bad move. Wait a minute. Sorry, that's the wrong story. Social movements, right. Those begin with a few ideas shared by a few. Then you have the incipient stage, when the public begins to take notice of a situation that they consider to be a problem. At this point, people begin to organize, to coalesce into an organized group, and raise up a general stink. A social movement's greatest achievement will be to either succeed in changing its host society, or else it will have to adapt. What is interesting about social movements is that, in the end, they become a part of the bureaucracy they were trying to change. A successful social movement eventually gets absorbed into the existing institutions when it has achieved its desired changes. Our entire culture and society is formed from past social movements, both those that have succeeded and those that have failed. Even in failure, social movements leave a mark on their society. The social movement Martin Luther began against the Catholic Church resulted in Protestantism. His namesake, Martin Luther King Jr., fronted a social movement against segregation leading to the Civil Rights Movement. Even Nazism left his lasting mark on world politics. In their time, each of these social movements seemed radical, far-fetched, extreme. Now, we accept Protestantism as a founded religion, and we don't think twice about the right every person has to freedom and equality. I wonder what social movements of today will become accepted thought in the future. So, in the end, the social movement eventually declines. If it succeeded, it has been incorporated into the dominant culture. If it failed, it isn't active anymore, but you can still see the marks it left on society by its passing.
I'm feeling nice, so we only had one video today. Although the videos are nice, so anyway. Okay, our reflection activity today. Simply, I want you to pretend that today's lesson was an event and you run a newspaper. What might your headline for today's lesson be? Just to summarize it in one half sentence. Homework for today. As always, I want you to read the relevant page from the textbook. These notes aren't going to make sense if you haven't also read the entire text. So read page 177 from the SEV Year 12 Sociology textbook. And I want you to answer this question. And this is something we've been working on heaps. This is really, really important. What is the difference between describing, explaining how, explaining why, analysing and evaluating? Really important higher order thinking skills there. You need to know the difference between them so that you can answer those questions meaningfully. So have a go at that. Thanks heaps for getting stuck into this lesson, and as always, keep it real.